Then we have a whole bunch of objects, and so on. We also have fonts and audio, but those aren't too important. Now, to get this project, you want to look at the video description. In there you can find a link to a Google Drive folder, which is going to look like this. In there, you have the project files for every single game. For example, right now, we are working in the Frogger game, and in there, you have the Frogger project setup and the Frogger start files. The second one you want to download, so download, and then your computer should be downloading the entire thing. Inside of the project stages, you're going to find this, by the way, the finished code for every single part of the game. If you get stuck somewhere, you can use that to figure out what went wrong. Should be quite helpful. But much more importantly, the file you just downloaded, it's going to look like this, and you want to extract it in the usual way. Then you're getting the Godot starting files. Right now, this is just a folder. To import the entire thing into Godot, you want to open the editor, and then you can simply drag and drop the files from the folder, the one you have just downloaded with all of the stuff inside. Just drag it in there, and then you're good to go. Open this one, and you should be seeing the project. Alternatively, you can go to Import, and then navigate to where you have to be, which in my case is going to be the Downloads folder. In there you have Frogger start files. Open this one, and then you want to open this project file inside of the folder. You are going to get the same result that you are seeing in here. Double click on that, and then you get exactly what I have started with. Other than that, this project does not contain any kind of script. All of this we have to create ourselves. And well, for that, first of all, I want to create a 2D scene, which I want to rename right away to game. Then save the entire thing with Ctrl S or scene and save. Scene, and I want to save it inside of the scenes folder. Game.tscn is totally fine. Save the entire thing with Ctrl S or scene and save scene, and I want to save it inside of the scenes folder. Game.tscn is totally fine. And now we have our first scene for the game, and this is going to contain all of the logic. So for example, attached to this is going to be the player, the background, all of the cars, and so on. Speaking of which, first of all, I want to add the background to it. And for that, we can look at graphics. In there somewhere, we have map.png. This I want to import. Or in other words, I want to create a sprite 2D, which somewhere around to it, and so on. Speaking of which, attached to this is going to be the player, the background, all of the cars, and so on. Speaking of which, first of all, I want to add the background to it. And for that, we can look at graphics. In there somewhere, we have map.png. this I want to import. Or in other words, I want to create a sprite 2D, which can hold a texture. So in other words, I want to drag map.png into this texture slot, and then we have the background. That is actually already pretty solid. I want to create a sprite 2D, which can hold a texture. So in other words, I want to drag map.png into this texture slot, and then we have the background. That is actually already pretty solid. That way we have at least something to look at. Next up, I want to create the player. For that, I want to create a new scene and then create another 2D scene. This is going to be for the player, and to that, I want to add another sprite 2D. This sprite 2D is going to display the player graphic. So let me zoom in a bit and then go to the folder graphics, player, and player symbol. Drag it inside of the texture, and then we have the player. Although, if you look closely, this is looking horrible. Also, while I'm talking about it, if you look at game and you zoom in into this map, this is also not looking great. So what's the problem here? When you have graphics, like for example the player, Godot has to scale it. This original player graphic for the player is 12 by 14 pixels, a really small graphic. And Godot, to make it this big, has to scale it up by a lot, which is totally fine. The issue is that there are different ways to scale a graphic, and the one that we are currently using is really not working. To fix that, all we have to do is go to Texture, and there we have Filter. At the moment, it's set to Inherit, but if we set this to Nearest, then this is looking significantly better. That being said, this isn't what I actually want to do, so let me undo it. Simply because I want to do this operation for every single graphic inside of my graphics folder. Doing it one by one would be kind of a pain. You can simply go to Project, Project Settings, and then look for Texture, and then look at Textures. In there, you have a default texture filter, which is set to linear by default, but we want to set it to Nearest. That way, by default, we are scaling default, but we want to set it to Nearest. That way, by default, we are scaling all of the graphics in this filter style, and that is going to look a lot better. Nice improvement. Then I want to save the scene, player.tscn is totally fine, and then we have the player. And this player we want to add to the game scene. So with game selected, I want to either instantiate a child scene or press Ctrl Shift and A, and then we can add the player scene to the game scene. If I now zoom in a bit, we can see the player. Let's move the player roughly here, so it's a bit easier to see. And then we can try to run the game. For that, click on this button here or press F5 on the keyboard, and then you want to select and then we can try to run the game. For that, click on this button here or press F5 on the keyboard, and then you want to select the current scene to start the game. Select current, then we're getting a graphic, and it does work, but it's really small at the moment. That we're going to fix later. For now, this is totally fine. I am happy with that. I suppose to see the player a bit better, we can scale the sprite 2D, which we do under transform, and then scale it by a factor of 6. If I now go back to game, the player should be much more visible. And that is definitely better. Alright, with that, we have two scenes that work together. Next up, we want to move the player in a certain direction. For that, the player scene needs to have a script. So click on Attach a new script. We want to have inherit node. Certain direction. For that, the player scene needs to have a script. So click on Attach a new script. We want to have inherit node 2D and save it inside of scenes and player.gd. All of this is fine. Click on Create, and now we can write a couple of lines of code. Now for the player, first of all, I want to have a couple of basic variables. I want to have a variable for the direction, and this needs to be a vector 2. If we set this data type, the default value that we are getting is going to be a vector 2 with x and y both being 0. Which is exactly what I want. Although, if you wanted to be a bit more specific here, you could do vector2.0. Same thing really, choose whatever you like. Besides that, for the player, I want to have a speed, which should be an integer, and for the default value, I want to go with, let's say, 200. Once we have that, I want to call a function that runs on every single frame. This could either be func_process, or it could be func_physics_process. I am going to use physics process because later on for collisions, we want to have just a bit of physics. Although at this point, it wouldn't really matter. And in here, we want to move the player position. Or in other words, we want to grab the position of the current node. Remember, when we are attaching a script to a node, like for the player at the moment, we get access to all of the stuff inside of the inspector. So at the moment, we are targeting the position via this position value. If you have an over position, you can see that this value wants to have a vector 2. And the way I am going to approach it, is I'm going to add a value to it, which is going to be our direction multiplied with the speed. And that's actually all we have to do, although at the moment this isn't going to do anything. So if I run the main scene, the player is not going to move, but that happens because our vector 2 for the direction is 0. We have a vector 2 with 0 and 0. And this we are multiplying with 200. The end result is going to be a vector with 0 and 0, so the position doesn't change whatsoever. However, what we can do is change this vector 2 to a value that's not 0. I want to have a vector 2 where x is 1 and y is 0. And now if I run this thing again, our player is moving to the right, although it is quite fast. Let's change this to a 5. And there we go. Now the player is moving to the right. If I set this to 1 and 1, then the player is moving right and down.
I've been using the Godot game engine.
That being said, if you look at the file system, we have a couple of folders. Most importantly, we have graphics. In there, open this one and you should be seeing use GDScript filter. At the moment, it's set to inherit, but 2D. Inherit node 2D false. Is I'm whatsoever is 0 is moving to the right. And now if I run this thing again, our player is moving to the right, although it is quite fast. Let's change this to a 5. And there we go. Now the player is moving to the right. If I set this to 1 and 1, then the player is moving right and down. And that is working pretty well. Perfect. With that, we have a really basic setup. Obviously, it doesn't do very much, but at the very least, we can move things around. Let's do an exercise. I want you to create a new scene with a few objects, like trees, boxes, whatever you like inside of the graphics folder. Add all of that to the scene, and then add the scene to the game scene. So you are decorating the entire thing a bit effectively. On top of that, use GDScript to scale up the scene over time. How fast this is going to happen is entirely up to you. Pause the video now and see how far you get. I want to add another scene, which once again is going to be a 2D scene. I want to add another scene, which once again is going to be a 2D scene. Let's call this one exercise object. The name really doesn't matter. And then save it. This scenes folder is totally fine. Save in here. And then we want to attach a couple of objects from the graph. Save in here. And then we want to attach a couple of objects from the graphics folder. Let's say I want to to start with a basic tree, you can actually just drag and drop it into the scene. Godot is automatically going to give you a save in here, and then we want to attach a couple of objects from the graphics folder. Let's say I want to start with a basic tree. You can actually just drag and drop it into the scene. Godot is automatically going to give you a sprite 2D. Although by default the position is going to be a bit weird. So let's reset that one, and then the tree is right in the center point of the scene. I guess besides that we can add another tree, and let's say we could add a box like so. This I want to save, and then inside of the game I can add, via this button or Ctrl-Shift-A, the exercise object. This we can place somewhere, let's say here. Then run the game, and we have another scene inside of the game. Doesn't look amazing yet, but at the very least we have something. Besides that, I want to add a script to the scene. All of the defaults here are totally fine. Then create, and like for the player, I want to run a function on every single frame of the game, which I am doing via physics process once again. Now for this thing, I want to target the scale property, which we can target via scale. So hover over the property inside of the inspector, and then you're getting some bits of information that are super useful. Once again, Godot wants to have a vector 2 with x and y, and that determines the scale. So to target it, I want to type scale and then assign a new value to it, where we want to get scale and multiply it with a value of, let's say, 1.1. Let's try the entire thing, and that might be quite fast. And yeah, it definitely is, but you get the idea. Let's change this to 1.001. Then it's not so strong anymore. Now we can see that the scene that we have just created is growing very, very slowly. Not something we can use for the actual game, but for an exercise, this is pretty alright. And with that, we are pretty much good to go for this part. Although there's one thing that is a bit annoying. If you look at the bottom, Godot is complaining with the debugger, where we have not 2 errors, but 2 warnings, that we are not using the delta parameter. To fix that, I want to add an underscore to both of them. That way Godot stops complaining. If I run the scene again now, the debugger stops. To fix that, I want to add an underscore to both of them. That way Godot stops complaining. If I run the scene again now, the debugger doesn't complain, which feels a lot better. Next up, we are going to move the player around using player input, which is bringing us a lot closer to an actual game. For that, we have to capture user input, which in Godot is quite easy. We can simply create an input map. Via that, we can capture keyboard, controller, joystick, and mouse input, which is really all that we need. So back in Godot, you want to go to Project, Project Settings, and at the top we have an input map. The way this thing is working is you define an action, and associated with this action, you have some kind of input, like a key press on the keyboard, for example. To Project, Project Settings, and at the top we have an input map. The way this thing is working is you define an action, and associated with this action, you have some kind of input, like a key press on the keyboard, for example. For example, I can type left and press enter, then we're getting one action for left. And to this action, we can assign events, which is a fancy way of saying a button on the keyboard, a mouse button, a joypad button, or whatever you have available in here. Godot is also listening for input, meaning if you press a button on the keyboard, for example the left arrow key, then it gives you the right option right away, which is super handy. So in my case, I want to click on OK, and now to the left action, we have the left physical button on the keyboard. Besides that, another action I want to add to it is the A button on the keyboard. Click on OK, and now we have 2 key bindings for this action. You could also add a controller, although for now I am not too worried about it. What I rather care about is to add other keyboard bindings. For up, right, and down. For all of these, I want to add the keyboard bindings. So for up, it's the up arrow on the keyboard or the W key. For right, I want to have D on the keyboard or the right arrow. And finally, for down, I want to have the S key or the down arrow. And that is all we need for now. We can close this dialog and then work inside of GD script. Specifically, I want to work inside of the player. Now there are a couple of ways to work with the keyboard bindings. The easiest one, I think, is to use input and then is action pressed. This is looking for an action that is being pressed. Let's start with the right action and then print the result. If I now run the code, by default we're getting false. Print the result. If I now run the code, by default we're getting false because the button is not pressed, but if I press right on the keyboard, we are getting true. If I release it, we're going back to false. The way we could use that, for example, is to only move the player if this value is true. Let me cut it out and add it to an if statement. Only if we are pressing the right button, then we want to move the player. If I run the thing now, the player is not moving, but if I press to the right, then the player is moving, which is already quite a bit better. Although this still isn't exactly what we want. To actually move the player in a certain direction, I want to keep position is equal to direction times speed. And then when we are pressing the right button, I want to change the direction to a vector2.right, which is the same as a vector with 1 and 0. Besides that, I want to duplicate all of this and then get the action pressed for left. If that is the case, direction should be vector2.left. If I now run the code, I can press to the right. The player is going to the right, and if I press left, we are going left. Should be vector 2 dot left. If I now run the code, I can press to the right, the player is going to the right, and if I press left, we are going left. And this kind of works, although the player never stops, which isn't ideal. Meaning we have to figure out some kind of system to organize the input and then get the right direction. There are a couple of ways of doing it, and the best way to get started is to look at